It's been a generation since the year 2000. The turn of a new century brought the rise of a globalized society, and with it, the need for a new trust compact. This generation could be defined by moments that changed the world. By influential people who shaped it. By technology that pushed boundaries. And movements that redefined society. For this entire generation, Edelman has been studying an intangible force that is vital to a strong social fabric.
Trust.
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 Trust is the foundation on which institutions can build a belief in the future.
Until 2021, NGOs were the most trusted institution. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, business has emerged as the most trusted, seen as both competent and ethical. But with higher trust comes greater responsibility. The public sees government and media feeding the cycle of distrust. In this networked world, mis- and disinformation run rampant, and individual experience eclipses expertise. There's a widening gap in trust between those with high versus low income. These divided realities intensify polarization and leave many feeling the system is not fair. Amidst these challenges to trust, our social fabric is unraveling. Yet, we have also found that trust is local. Teachers, doctors, and neighbours are highly trusted. Local trust has the power to radiate outward. The world may have never been more divided.
We need to restore trust in order to bridge the divides in society.
Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Bianca Freedman. I am the CEO of Edelman Canada and truly thrilled to welcome all of you tonight on what is an important day for the country. We are joined by, we are having an in-person and online event and have almost 700 friends across the country dialed in. So I guess no pressure for us as speakers tonight. Before we begin, we acknowledge that you are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I would like to start tonight rather than end with a few thank yous, as this event truly takes a village, and if I see a lot of Edelman alumni in the crowd tonight, so you know because you've been through it. But first, I want to thank our esteemed panelists, who Graham Richardson will introduce later. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our incredible Edelman Canada team. As an agency, we've been recognized by the Drum as North America's agency to watch. We've also been awarded within the top 3 of PR agencies of the year by Strategy. And to the entire team that put this on this event, thank you. Thank you to the Globe and Mail for the beautiful venue. 2025 marks 25 years of studying trust at Edelman. And because of that, we're doing things a little bit different tonight, and we have a special guest. So in a moment, I am going to welcome Matt Harrington, Global President and COO of Edelman. He's been with the firm a long time. He can tell you how long, but it's been a while. And he's also been on a global world tour of trust in cities like from Madrid to Milan to Manhattan and everything in between. So he's going to bring a lot of great insights for us tonight, talking about the macro trends that we've seen over the 25 years, and also a quick look at global results before I come back and present the Canadian results. After that, I'll bring Matt up for a fireside chat with Graham Richardson, and then we'll have our panel to unpack everything that we're seeing tonight and perhaps what's going on right now. So without any further ado, I welcome Matt Harrington to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. I don't think anybody actually really wants to hear about how long I've been at Edelman, but it's been more than half of the firm's life existence. Thank you, everyone, and hello, Canada. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today. I'm confident we're going to have a very interesting conversation because of the data and because of our times. And so as Bianca just said, I'm just going to spend a few minutes for setting some global context for this moment and where we find ourselves. And I think because it's the 25th year, it's worth taking a look at sort of the arc of what over 2 decades of studying trust has taught us. I want to start with sort of how we start a conversation about studying trust. And it really is down to the rudimentary. Trust is the degree to which an individual believes another institution or individual will do the right thing. It's as simple as that. And trust, is really it's the license to operate, it's the license to lead, it's the license to engage. And so that's what we've been really wanting to study. What was the inspiration? It really goes back to 1999 and the first World Trade Organization event and meeting in Seattle, what became known as the Battle of Seattle, when civil society took to the streets and took issue with the closed-door meetings held between government and business leaders with civil society outside the door. And the media covered this moment, and it really was a watershed moment, I think, in a lot of respects. And we wanted to understand the dynamic of what had happened, which led us to the study of trust. And over the course of the study, we have really understood how dynamic trust is. It's hard-fought and easily lost. And the way we look at this, and I'm not going to go through all 25 years, but there have been seminal moments within the 25 years. And I will just call out a few of these. 2005, we saw the shift as social media began to emerge of the collapse of the pyramid of influence. And one where we really moved to a peer-to-peer, a person like myself is where I get my trusted information and news. 2016, we saw the mass class divide and the beginnings of what now we navigate in a highly polarized world. We, in 2018, recognized that the battle for truth was on. The misinformation that began to really be seen in 2016 with the decision for Brexit in the UK, that decision was fed in a lot of instances with, best case I can tell, alternative economic facts and alternative data that has subsequently moved to a decision that maybe was not in a population's best interests, at least 5 years out, and according to many. And then, as the video pointed out, we had this moment in 2021 where business assumed most trusted institution. Government had a brief moment in the spring of 2020, 5 years ago, where government in June of that year was most trusted. It was a byproduct of rapid response to COVID, but it was a fleeting moment. And business that following year became the most trusted institution. What we then began to see was, over the last several years, fear began to emerge amongst the respondents that we study, and fear about all sorts of factors in their lives. And it's resulted in an inability to move forward in improving trust. This slide is our index. It's looking at all 4 institutions that we study, but at a country level. And it's to who's trusting, who is neutral, and distrusting. This year, for the 4th year in a row, China's most trusting country. This has had it's a tick down. It's 2 points down year on year. There are some cracks in their trust relative to their economic picture and reality. But I'll briefly say that China's position is really a byproduct of an understanding that as a collective and as a country, they have been improving their economic lot over the last couple of decades, and then migrating from an agrarian society to one where the creation of the middle class in a more urban environment has seen advancement for many. And that's really an instance, what you see with most of the developing countries that are in the more trusting category. Of note on the distrusting, it tends to be a lot of Western European countries. It also, you see Japan, where I think the social contract's been broken over the past couple of decades between employer and employee. And I think that's led to, their position, but it's noteworthy. UK was least trusting year prior. And had a little bit of improvement this year. So what are the fears factors that are really driving this. There are three macro buckets. It's globalization, it's economic pressure, and it's the fear of technology. The globalization, it's the geopolitics, it's everything that we in Canada are experiencing today coming to life and recognizing how rapidly the economic picture can change. Concerns about economic pressures, which are also very evident today. And then on the technology front, it's really around AI and technologies that are disruptive and potentially job-losing and putting jobs at risk, and people feeling they don't have the training for that to go forward. Another finding from this year, in my quick overview here, has been there's been a modest decline of trust with employer. And I think what this is reflecting is a workforce that is anxious about their place and about their company's ability to navigate these challenging times. So they're single-digit changes, save for Argentina and Ireland. Ireland has been on an economic boom, and so there's a little bit increased trust there. I look at this as a bit of a, is this a canary in the coal mine, indicating a continued pressure on the employer in terms of how they advance and develop a sense of community, a sense of job creation for their workforce. Another big headline that's been developing over the last couple of years has been the worlds of the haves and the have-nots. And this is data that speaks to high income, logically in many respects, are more trusting of the institutions that we study. And you see here significant trust in business. The higher income individuals are beneficiaries of an economy that's moving forward. What we see in a global basis is a 13-point delta, though, between high and low income. And it's exacerbated even more in terms of trust of business. Low income, 16 points less trusting than high income. And that does play across the board with a double-digit less trusting amongst the lower income. That has lent itself in some respects to fears of different manifestations. And one of them is that lack of trust in institutions is this sense that the leaders of the institutions are lying to us. And this is particularly alarming, I think, when you look at 69% view around the globe that government leaders are misleading or outright lying to us. Business leaders at 68%, up 12 points year on year, which is obviously not the right trend to be taking. And journalists, as part of a media class that have been challenged relative to trust in the last while, I think there's an emergence, which I suspect we'll get into in the panel, talking about the loss of trust there. This, for me, was the most distressing data point of the 2025 survey. 4 in 10 see hostile activism as a viable means to drive change. We were in field the back half of October and the early part of November, and to see that over 1 in 2 young adults 18 to 34 believe that violence is appropriate if it leads to change does give me some understanding of the reaction to the murder of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, in December. That people really have such an issue with the U.S. healthcare system that an action of taking someone's life was viewed as maybe the extreme that needed to cause the conversation to open up and to investigate and understand more what's going on in that industry. This is concerning on so many different societal levels, but it's remarkable to see in this year's report. I'm really the deliverer of wonderful news today. I'm going to pivot now to the concerns people have about the future. This question we've been asking for several years, and we've had better survey data in certain years. This year's not one of them. More than a third of folks we surveyed globally don't believe the next generation will be as well off as they are today. And this is mostly developed countries and say they are considerably less optimistic about the future for the next generation. You'll see on the far right here that developing markets such as Saudi Arabia and again China are seeing optimism and feel that there, but it's this lack of optimism that's undermining trust as well. And needs to be addressed. I also think it's noteworthy that on a global basis, fear of being discriminated against has achieved all-time highs, and it's across numerous communities. and which is, I think, also noteworthy. And it's high around the globe, and regardless of even how sort of homogenous one society may be, there is this emerging concern about discrimination. So where does this leave us? There is a path forward, in particular for business, and the first step for my purposes is acknowledging where your stakeholders are. Stakeholders, customers, employees are struggling. They are experiencing pain in different ways and forms. And I think the first piece is understanding that and acknowledging it. Coming from the US, I could say the Democratic Party blew it on a number of levels, but one of the levels, most particularly, they didn't understand the constituents. They didn't understand what the constituents, what the American life is living at the moment, and talked over and around and beyond where the voter was. And so really acknowledging that is important. Business has a license to act, as I've said previously, and there's an expectation that business will step up and address this moment. Business can't act alone. Business partnership is incredibly important, whether it's within industry and sector, it's with partnership with NGOs at a community level, it's partner with government. Trust is local. And so there's an opportunity to recognize that and operate at a local level in partnership. And the final point I'll make is that, we see trust extended where optimism exists. And it's a challenging environment, which I've outlined here, but there are reasons to believe and have hope. There is, businesses can talk about economic power that they bring to a community. They can talk about the jobs that are created. They can talk about the value that they create. And I think that story is not sort of striking the right balance at the moment because there is so much concern, and the overarching narrative, and it's hard to say this today, but the overarching narrative is around the geopolitical, the economic challenges that are facing all of us. But we have to find moments as business leaders to provide some optimism because I think that's an element of how we get back to restoring resilient trust. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment and now turn it back to Bianca to talk more specifically about Canada. But thank you for your attention.
I can't promise it's going to go up from here in terms of tone, but I do have some Canadian results. Thank you so much, Matt. So as you saw, trust is in a tough place for most Western democracies. So let's take a look at Canada. First, to touch on methodology, we study 28 countries around the world and had 33,000 respondents this year. In Canada, we had 2,100 respondents, which for the experts in the room, including our former Chief Statistician for Canada, who is going to be in our panel tonight, that represents a margin of error of about 3%. And as you can see, the survey was conducted between October 25th and November 16th. So given that so much has happened since then, let's just take a moment to put ourselves in the shoes of that mindset. So at the time, we had non-confidence votes in the federal parliament, and the Liberal ranks were beginning to fracture. There were also elections in BC, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick. And of course, the US election happened on November 5th, so that was very much top of mind, and tariffs were beginning to be discussed. Given the moment that we're in, we also, for the first time, issued a quick pulse survey last week just to see where people are at on a couple of key questions. And so we'll touch on that as we go through. Okay, so overall, despite the major events unfolding during our survey period, trust in Canada's core institutions remains stable with only a 1% drop from last year, well within the margin of error. At 52%, Canada is in that neutral category, which is a stark contrast to 2012 to 2014 period when we were actually very much trusting in the 60-point range. So over time, other than the spike of COVID, which I'll talk about in a minute, we have been on a steady decline, and the trust in our key institutions has been eroding in Canada. Given that we're still faring better than our Western peers, 5 points higher than the US and 9 points ahead of the UK. But being less distrusted is not the same as being trusted. The challenge ahead is clear. How do we rebuild trust and confidence in our key institutions? Across the 4 individual institutions we study, business, media, NGOs, and government, we remain stable with only 2 or 1% drops from last year. Trust levels are clustered in that neutral category, with all hovering around the gray zone, 55 for business and 50 for government. And for the past 5 years, that neutrality has persisted, except for COVID in 2020, when government trust surged to 70%, and that was largely due to the pandemic response. So in times of crisis, people do tend to rally around our institutions, but this is not what we've seen from our flash survey that we did last week. We actually saw trust in all 4 key institutions drop, with the biggest drop being in media at 7 points. And so why? We will unpack that in our panel tonight. One theory that we have is that people are fatigued by all of the news from the US, and maybe we're just over it, although it's very much here. But that's one theory, so I'm sure we'll discuss that more on the panel. And despite moderate trust in institutions, people place greater trust in individuals. Scientists in particular remain the most trusted, both in Canada and globally. And trust is absolutely local. Teachers and neighbors, who play a direct role in the lives of so many Canadians, enjoy the strongest trust ratings. And this proximity effect explains the huge delta we see between my CEO and a CEO. So people trust their CEO of their own company, but they don't trust CEOs in general. And in Canada, CEO trust is especially low. So I'm taking note here too. We rank dead last, trailing government leaders by 7 points, and CEOs at the global level by 16 points. This is definitely something we want to talk about on the panel. But I believe that trust in CEOs is low because Canadians feel that corporate leaders are profiting while everyday people are struggling. The combination of rising costs, high job insecurity, high executive pay, and public scrutiny with some of our key leaders in our country has given this perception that CEOs are not acting in the best interests of society. So until corporate leaders can truly put people before profits, I do think that trust will remain fragile. We also need to continue to work on building that personal connection between CEOs and everyday Canadians to benefit from that proximity effect that we see in other individuals. Okay, let's explore how financial pressures impacted Canadian trust. The good news first, the trust gap between high-income and low-income Canadians has not only narrowed over time, but it's actually the smallest among all 28 countries that we survey. But there's a little bit of a twist. Our smaller gap isn't because low-income trust has risen, it's because high-income trust is lower here than on the global stage, so 55 in Canada versus 61 globally. Unlike the ultra-wealthy elsewhere, Canada's top 25% income earners, which we have at 80K plus, may not feel truly rich. Many still experience financial pressures, especially with rising housing and grocery costs. That could explain why we don't exhibit the same levels of trust seen among high-income earners in other countries. We don't have as much ultra-wealth in Canada as exists in other countries. Looking deeper, the trust gap is most pronounced in business, 10 points, government, 8 points, while media remains equal across both high and low-income Canadians. Canadians' concerns about financial stability aren't just driven by housing prices and increasing grocery costs. Similar to what Matt talked about in the global results, half of Canadians feel that their jobs are at risk, not just from economic pressures, but from globalization and technology. And although these fears are lower than the global average by about 10 points, they're steadily rising, especially in the globalization category, which makes sense given all of the conversation on tariffs. And we've seen the result of that with people moving on this Buy Canadian movement over the past few weeks. These growing fears are shaping how Canadians perceive the future, not just in terms of their jobs, but in terms of the broader trust in institutions and our overall economic stability. If these anxieties continue to rise, they will further erode confidence in business and government, reinforcing that sense of economic fragility that so many of us are feeling. And when we look into the future, only 1 in 5 Canadians believe that the next generation will be better off, which is similar to the global results, but it is strikingly un-Canadian. Typically, the barometer has shown much more optimism in Canada, which does signal deeper, perhaps longer-standing concerns locally. Who is more optimistic, though? It's the young people aged 18 to 34, the very next generation that we are talking about. They are 11 points more positive than those aged 55 plus. And pessimism is not unique to Canada. Across Western democracies, even in countries with high quality of life standards like Germany, Sweden, Australia, and us, outlooks are negative. Meanwhile, booming economies, as Matt talked about, show greater confidence in the future. Yet even with our strong social safety nets, Canada is 10 points less optimistic than the US and 15 points behind the global average. Why the gloom? That is a question we've been talking about internally as we unpack these results. Canadians have experienced so much over the past few months, from rising inflation, the housing crises, political instability in Parliament, to what we're now facing with US tariffs, that it really has been smooth sailing. So many of these trends that apply to other Western democracies are very much fueling the fear locally here as well about what's ahead. And Canadians are not only feeling less optimistic about the future, it goes deeper with a really intense frustration that we're calling grievance. 62% hold grievances against government, business, and the wealthy, including 1 in 5 in Canada with high levels of grievance. And what we mean when we say grievance is a belief that government and business will cause harm and serve narrow interests, and ultimately the wealthy will benefit while regular people struggle. And in Canada, 22% of people have high levels of grievance. So this is a statistic that people, I think, would happily ignore, but it really cannot be ignored. It's an important warning sign to Matt's point about what people are feeling and something that we can all look at in our individual organizations. And I don't mean to bring so much gloom, but with the lack of optimism in our future, key institutions really need to be aware of rising radicalism here as well. Amid mounting frustrations, hostile activism is gaining traction, 38% of Canadians approving of it, which is something that I think we like to believe it doesn't apply to us in Canada, but it absolutely does. 2/3 of younger adults aged 18 to 34 approve of hostile activism, while very few at 55 plus too. This 50-point generational gap is double the global average and really starts to show those deep fractures that we have in Canadian society, even among generations. This sign of deep societal shifts could really redefine activism, politics, and public discourse as we know it in Canada. So we've talked about Canadians being uncertain about the future, unsure of what to trust, and really disturbingly, a growing number of folks seeing violent action as a solution. I don't know about you, but this just is not the Canada I grew up in. Around the world, people are feeling this deep sense of grievance. And part of what's driving this is that people believe that leaders are deliberately misleading Canadians. 2/3 of Canadians believe that government, business, and media lie to them. Historically, we've fared better on this question, but Canada, unfortunately, has caught up to that global trend. I love this New York Times article, Building Trust in an Age of Distrust by Andrew Ross Sorkin. He suggests that in a world of complex issues like trade war, AI ethics, the housing crises, and economic inequality, people crave simple answers, and leaders are under pressure to provide flawless solutions, and while their every word and move is scrutinized in real time. This pressure is actually pushing leaders to move away from leadership positions. We've seen resignations in federal government, we've seen a wave of mayoral resignations in Quebec, and a record number of CEOs stepping down. The key takeaway here is that people, whether we think it's right or not, people feel that they're being lied to and misled. So it's really important that we show the thought behind decisions that are made, be transparent, accountable, and clear in the way that we communicate to try to buck this trend. And distrust in leadership is not happening in a vacuum. 2/3 of Canadians struggle to distinguish between real news and misinformation. And we all know that this is only going to get worse because it's really quite remarkable to see how realistic some of the news articles that are out there look. They look identical to CBC articles. They look identical to Globe and Mail articles. So it's really hard for people to discern between what's real and what's fake. And so we're really in this era of misinformation, and we've talked about this for a few years now at Trust, and it's so fragile. So all we can do as organizations is really focus on transparency, verifiable data, proactive engagement, and making sure that we put forward trusted voices to build credibility and tell our story clearly. So what can we do with all this? There are definitely, people want to see business take on more. Most people believe that business is not doing enough. But there has been a shift in priorities for Canadians. For the first time, financial and professional concerns have overtaken climate change in terms of what the top actions are that people want to see from business. Even though we've had another year of extreme weather alerts, extreme weather conditions around the world, this is where people's minds are at. People are looking for economic leadership from business and environmental commitments. And let's be honest, with all of this, the balance is not easy. Public expectations for business leadership are rising, yet CEO activism is on the steep decline, creating this widening gap between what people demand from leaders and what people feel comfortable delivering or talking about. So in these times where there's such deep polarization, the challenge isn't just about speaking out, it's about finding credible, industry-aligned ways to take meaningful action and run great businesses without falling into the trap of performative leadership. And despite varying levels of grievance, there is strong consensus across Canada on what business should be focused on. A large majority of Canadians believe that business have an obligation to provide good-paying jobs, invest in reskilling employees, and foster civility in the workplace. These things are not just a nice to have, they really do build a better future, especially when so many Canadians are uncertain about what lies ahead. And speaking of expectations toward business, from our Pulse survey last week, if you're a US company, your trust dropped by 15 points last week due to recent events, while Mexican companies rose by 8 points. So this is very real and very top of mind. Matt already gave us some great takeaways for business, and he is going to come up and talk to Graham in a moment, just a little bit more in depth about what to do with business. But I just want to give a couple of thoughts when it comes to leadership. So one is that we need to really address these hidden grievances. In Canada, it looks like neutrality. It looks like asking someone, how are you? And they say, good. It's just kind of surface level. But when we dig deeper, when we really understand what's going on with our employees, our customers, our stakeholders, we see that they're really struggling and they want business to be a beacon. They want business to be ethical and competent. And same goes for other key institutions, of course. This one's really important to me personally, is staying true to our values, especially in uncertainty. I think there's so much noise right now, if I can put it that way, that is making us believe that we have to abandon some of our core beliefs as companies or as leaders. And I really believe that in these moments, staying true to your values will be respected by employees and customers and help you build trust over time. And related to that is just the idea of paradoxical leadership, the idea that two things can be true at once. We can deliver results and uphold ethics. We can run a great business and have a great culture inside of our companies. These things can coexist, and I think we need to remember not to get forced into this false sense of either or and this trap of polarization that we all find ourselves in. And last, you all know this because you came out to listen to a presentation about trust, and I thank you so much for that. But trust is absolutely a long game, but it can be lost very quickly. And it's similar to how you build trust with people that you care about in a relationship. It's competence and ethics. It's character and competence. It's both of those things. You need to deliver what we promised. So we delivered what you promised to customers or what we promised to constituents, but also do this with ethical considerations and just have a strong sense of character. So I will leave us with that, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Matt Harrington back to the stage. I'm also going to welcome Graham Richardson, who has been with Edelman just over a year now, but you may recognize him because he's been on the air before that for 30 plus years, most recently with CTV News Ottawa. So thank you, Graham and Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Bianca. It's great to be here, back in my hometown. We're going to lighten things up now. Let's talk about the Oscars. No. It's interesting. Bianca mentioned those mayors in Quebec. One of them is in Gatineau, right across the river from where I live in Ottawa. And another one is in Eastern Ontario. They both quit because of harassment. They quit because of online hate. And who needs this? And the reason I'm bringing this up, Matt, is because I know there's some business leaders out here looking at this data saying, I'm out. I don't need to engage because it's too risky and it's too dangerous out there. If someone said that to you, I'm sure some of your clients have, what is the advice in this volatile environment?
So perhaps easy for me to say, but I believe it. I think it's a greater risk not to engage. I think it's a risk for a business's license to operate. It's an opportunity for vitality. I think leadership has always had its demands, and I don't underestimate the pressures that are under business leaders today. But I think to abdicate and let the toxicity of the marketplace drive the agenda for you and or your business, it's not going to end well.
What do you think's going on? And we'll talk to the panel about this as well. I'm surprised at a number of things, but I'm surprised that the Canadian CEO number is so low. And we had a gathering last night. We talked a bit about that. I have to think in my gut that it's something about circumstances, something about some of the news coverage. Some people last night mentioned Loblaw, fairly high-profile CEO. I don't know if that's what's going on, but any thoughts on that? Why we're near the bottom of the world in CEO trust?
So I mean, it's an achievement of one form. I do think, from my vantage point, the coverage of CEO as a class in the last year in Canada has largely been the Loblaw situation, and so that becomes proxy for CEOs. Over the course of the years, we've asked our survey participants to name up to 3 CEOs, and most failed. They usually, one name, it would be a Bill Gates, or back in the day, it was a Steve Jobs. But I also think it's a lack of familiarity with who are the individuals, so it's easier, therefore, to demonize an entire role when the primary sort of knowledge is CEOs are sort of running the table, and in a world where there's this increasing sense of the playing field not being level, they're inside the room where it's happening, and I'm not, and the compensation delta between the CEO and the average employee is just exponentially greater than it's ever been before, and the resentment begins there, and I think compounds.
And that notion, and we're going to get into this with the panel as well, and I know you will have a chance to ask some questions, but the notion that we're not in on it, that something's going on out there or in those boardrooms that excludes me and the contract's been broken. It feels like through all the data, particularly in the Western world, that is just everywhere. It feels like this wasn't the deal that my parents had and my grandparents had, and I'm really angry about it. Is that a fair statement, you think?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the extremes are greater than ever before, which is an ironic situation when you've seen the leveling of and sort of the more egalitarian access to information, and the breadth and wealth of everything that we have the opportunity to know. But there are these senses that there are these cocoons where the power really resides and lives. I attended a conference last Wednesday in New York that was private equity, asset managers, and some corporates. And the orientation of the convening was mostly around long-term. thinking about the long term, which is, not genuinely what those communities think about. They have to think much more quarterly. What was interesting as a byproduct of the conversation was the level of distress exhibited by pretty much everybody in the room about the role of boards, and that boards aren't thinking about the breadth of constituents and the broader stakeholders, and that they have a much more short term. And I'm thinking, okay, this is a group of individuals who are part of the leadership class, and yet they too feel they're outside of a room and would run that room differently if they had the opportunity and have a different expectation to expect. So it's not alone with the CEOs. We just don't have to happen to survey about boards.
And was there a sense of why they felt that way? Was it quarter to quarter from the boards too much? Is it that simple? Or is it more complex?
A sense that also, in many respects, the board is really focused on fulfilling senior management's objectives and holding their primary job is fulfilling the KPIs for CEO and making certain that that's the job. And longer term range planning, thinking about financing implications to climate are something that the board isn't addressing and driving. Now that's a broad statement. It's not the case for every company, but I was intrigued in this room to have that emerge as a sentiment.
We're in the Globe and Mail building. Shannon Proudfoot's here, a feature writer who's going to be on our panel. I checked the Globe and Mail. I trust the Globe and Mail. I checked it all day long because of what was going on. Can you, and I think lots of people in this room are in the same boat, but I also know from my own experience before I left the industry that a large number of people are turning away and going to that neighbor and going to social media. And the neighbor's fine because it's face-to-face experience, which is what the data shows, but the social media piece as well. Can you just talk a bit about implications for business and trying to get into that chaotic information space? Because I view it as kind of a raging river of chaos. And it used to be, as a mainstream broadcaster, I could stand on the banks and say, that's not us, we're going to do this straight news. And you can't anymore. Everybody has to get in and wave their flag. Do you believe business has to do that as well?
Well, business has to do it on a couple of different fronts. I mean, I think there's an instance of making certain that business is still very much part of both the coverage of mainstream media, but is actively in conversation. So back to your first question about, not abdicating being part of a conversation with media. I think the bigger challenge, and you've mentioned this previously, is that the collective community convening around a 6 o'clock broadcast or a singular focus on one diet of news is gone. That's dissipated entirely. And there's a cost to that. Because now everybody has the benefit of selecting the news they choose to consume and are party to the algorithm selecting the news that you're going to consume. And that, we're no longer necessarily operating with a level playing field of baseline facts, baseline information, or baseline knowledge, which is concerning for me.
Yeah, and challenging as well if you're trying to get in, trying to reach people. The rules have really changed.
Yeah, well, and it's a huge demographic shift as well. So, the aging of the viewer, the aging of the reader of some of the traditional media is real, and the younger generation in terms of their consumption is changing. I think, the business media environment has changed dramatically in the last decade. I think there are reasons for hope, too, as business consumers of news, with the emergence of some of the new platforms like Semaphore, Axios, and I think that they are a bright light in the consumption world of a younger leadership and business. But it's a real challenging environment. I'm representative of a dying breed. I have 3 newspapers thrown down my driveway. And I read the print. I'm the last person on the train now reading a print edition, and I do it for a point. I want to see how the news is laid out in print. I go to the digital versions during the course of the day, but it's a different absorption process. It continues to be for me, but nobody's really interested.
And the other thing that I'm struck by, it's funny you tell that story. I'm the same way. I subscribe to the New Yorker. I have for years, and I want the print version. because it's a different feeling when I'm reading and I physically put my phone away. I feel less bombarded. And I know we all have the same feeling. Like I have to physically separate my digital diet in order to concentrate in a different way. And I do. I feel like a bit of a dinosaur, but it is a different. You're the last one on the train.
Yeah, I mean, literally the last person on the train. And I had, years ago, I was having a conversation at the New York Times, and I said, how much longer are you going to be throwing a paper down my driveway? And Arthur Sulzberger said, well, as long as you'll pay an ever-rising price for that privilege. Yeah. I do think just on the media consumption piece as well, for businesses, it's changing how we show up with our workforce. And I'm working with a CEO right now he's got all 5 generations, as we all do, in the workforce. And he's recognizing, as he's newly in his current role, that he needs to work every single channel. So he's using, email for a large part of his distributed workforce. He is doing TikTok-like videos, which have unbelievable impact and uptake. And
yes,
I'm so pleased with how he is altering his communication mode to meet his workforce where they are. And I think that is all what we all have to be doing.
In all circumstances, in crisis, like you have to be blasting on all channels, and it's exhausting. But you can just see it. And I told this story last night during the trucker convoy in Ottawa. I was on the streets for about 3 weeks with a phone and a parka and no CTV crew. I got lots of access, great stories, and I was pushing it out on social, and all my son's friends said, your dad's a reporter, eh? And of course, it's because it was out on TikTok and out on, it was a striking moment for me, like your chart of big moments, because there's a whole swath of people on the streets there who believed that mainstream was, as we've seen in the data, not, I disagree with you, you're lying to me as part of your strategy. And that to me is chilling in the fact that the numbers have gone up so much. Give us some, is there any, you say something about that, but also before we close and get to our panel, what are you hopeful about? Because we've kind of kidded about it, it is a fairly grim report.
Yeah, so I am hopeful about business taking the leadership mantle. As challenging as it is, as you outlined in the first question, I do see business leaders stepping up and trying to be that connection point with some of these bigger challenges with their employees, and to try to create a civil workforce. We saw that, I think, in the U.S. election, where a lot of companies really said, this is who we are, these are our values, and we're not going to engage in politics. And we just assumed politics got left in the parking lot because we have a job to do that's different than engaging in the debate of what's going on outside the building. So I think that the pendulum is swung on a number of areas that I think maybe is helpful for leadership to really focus on the business and the role of the leader in terms of helping the worker be focused on how they're best set up to succeed and achieve in the years to come. I am, as I said, I find the media, as challenging it is for sort of trusted mainstream media, I do think the role of journalism clearly has never been more important. I think the degree to which the understanding of what reporting requires and the understanding of journalism is really important. So it's back to that transparency and educating the reader. And I think in the US, post 2016, there was an effort against that, and I think it needs to be renewed. I'm not naive to the fact, though, that we also have had an emergence of broadcast news in the US in particular, really leave the premise of not having a bias to actually having an agenda. And I think that's across the broadcast media in the U.S. And that has its challenges, but actually, most consumers have opted out, as we've seen with the rating collapse at MSNBC and CNN.
And you don't mind me saying, you personally,
yeah.
on Morning Joe,
I haven't watched it since November 6th.
What was it about it?
I think, so I would characterize irrational exuberance as the likely outcome of the election.
Right.
And they were, I was right there with them. Yeah, I didn't mean to get political, but
No, yeah, fair enough.
But I was seeing us as a country going in a particular direction that they were every day, whether it was James Carville or a host, Michael Steele, the breadth of the guests, they were all sort of online. We were missing the entire story.
Yes.
And they were missing the entire story, and that was a massive disservice to us.
My algorithms on all my socials, I generally I don't follow a lot of Trump people. I follow Republicans. I don't follow a lot of, but my algorithm was very, very similar. And so I missed it, and I missed it. And I think it's a reminder to all of us about the tribalism piece and about when we go into camps. Sometimes we miss big things. And I think
so to that end, I think, another piece on the media consumption is, Axios had a big piece today about understanding the MAGA media universe, which is large, and we're learning a lot more about it. That's really important to understand what platforms people are engaging and consuming. And I've become a very big student of that in the last 12 weeks. But I wish I'd been a student of it prior. But it's really important to understand now because it's driving narrative and it's driving agenda in the U.S. And what we're trying to all navigate is what is making some sense of the world, which seems to be whiplashing every 12 hours. And I think if you track some of this media now, you begin to see where this narrative may go. And that can only be helpful to all of us. So we have to change our diet, but remain active consumers.
You'll stick around for questions?
I will.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Matt.
Graham.
Appreciate that. That's Matt Harrington. Thanks so much. Some positivity there, I think. We're going to have time for your questions. I want to call up our panel right now. Three colleagues, come on up. Yep. To talk about what we're seeing. We've got Katherine Henderson, President and CEO of Hockey Canada. Right here, Katherine, who is still celebrating the Four Nations. I keep mentioning it when I see you because it's been a nice couple of weeks. Anil Arora, former Chief Statistician at Statistics Canada, also Adjunct Professor at Harvard Kennedy School, and Shannon Proudfoot, feature writer with the Globe and Mail in Ottawa, in her own building. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. We'll go from here to there. What strikes you in these numbers, and how, what stands out for you, I guess in the context of Hockey Canada and some of the things you're trying to turn around in this year's Trust Barometer? Yeah. Kept it fairly broad for you.
Yeah, well, it's I'm sure everybody in the room and online knows is that Hockey Canada has gone through some significant blows, I think, to their trust relationship with Canadians, and taking a look at those numbers, it just really reinforces to me how critically important it is to keep trust, front and center. I mean, it is a long, long road to hoe in an environment like this, to make sure that we're doing all the right things, to make sure that Canadians trust us, and we've. Looking at those, they're kind of daunting, those numbers. Not that we're not committed to doing it, but it's in quite a fraught environment.
You're making progress. We don't have to get into the details. Yeah. Obviously, a very high profile, very challenging situation. Yeah. And then you have the euphoria of what the game is. I would imagine when Connor McDavid scored, that was a polar opposite to when you first came in trying to turn the ship around.
Yeah, no.
Fair?
Fair. I'm actually going to mention, two euphorias that I was able to experience within a couple of weeks of each other. I was in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, when Team Canada's women beat the U.S. in the rivalry series, and handing that trophy to Marie-Philippe Poulin. It was a euphoric moment. And it was particularly euphoric at the time just because we were starting to get the rumblings of things that were going on, sort of in the political sphere. Not to say that the game was political at all, but it was a particularly sweet victory, and it was a very hard-won victory. It was 3-2 in a 5-game series, and And it was the very, very, end of the game. It was just a couple of minutes left when the Canadians really sort of, decided we're going to win this and we're going to have this trophy. And then, of course, I was in Boston when Canada won the gold medal. Team Canada won the gold medal at the Four Nations Cup in an environment that I'm not sure I had ever experienced quite that level of sort of politicization around it. I mean, we had the President of the United States phoning the American hockey team and everyone blasting it on media, and there was all sorts of rhetoric going on around us. So the win to me, as I've heard from a lot of people, it wasn't the win of a hockey game. It was very much representative of what Canadians, wanted to demonstrate is a Canada that could stand together, united and strong.
Felt better, or it felt bigger. It felt bigger than a game.
Yeah.
It was a big game. Anil, you talked this week about the break of the contract. And my example, anecdotal, is the two income graduating university people without kids who are now out in the world. Maybe they have jobs, and it's not 2002 anymore, or 2005, or 1995. They're years and years and years away from being able to own a home in this country, no matter where you are. Is that what's at play in Canada in some way?
Well, first of all, I wonder if today would have happened if the U.S. had won the game. But anyways, yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're, the promise, which is, I worked really hard, I played by the rules, and so why am I not getting ahead? That's very real. It's being felt. And so it's not like, grow up and, you're spoiled and this, that. Like, have a look at some of the numbers. And if you're an immigrant, a recent immigrant, you come in, you say, look, I'm going to work really hard, I'm going to save up, I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to join the middle class, etc. Or I'm a young person, I'm going to find somebody, we're going to, all those metrics are going in the wrong direction. Look at our fertility rate, 1.26, unions, kids, not happening. Look at home ownership rates, they're coming down, especially so for the youth. They're working really hard, they're making an income. But when I bought my first house, the price of the house was like 3 or 4 times what I was making. Well, imagine even if you're making $100,000 today, 3 or 4 times that, what are you going to get, right? Especially not here, especially not in Vancouver. Like looking at 10, 20 times that, it's going to take them just as long to save for the down payment than it did for some of us to actually pay the whole house off. So, and that just doesn't just stress them; it stresses all the other generations as well. And so when you see some of the numbers, of trust and hope and confidence in that system, it's very real. Look at the healthcare system. 6 million Canadians without a family doctor. So how do you get that kind of care? And what does that experience look like? And it's not so, even kind of a universal So on so many fronts, that promise is just that formula. I work really hard, I play by the rules, I get ahead. It's just not working. And so you see the life satisfaction, and you see the trust levels come down. And there's demographics at play, there's economics at play, and there's a whole social cohesion issue that's at play. So these numbers that we're seeing are very real. We have to take stock of them. But you know what? We can move ahead. So there's some, it is a more complex system. So the solutions are also going to have to be a little bit more nuanced and complex. And so I think some real expert help is going to be required.
We'll whip that around in a minute. Shannon, you've been very patient, and I know you're writing. And my guess is none of this surprises you. Those feelings out there, or maybe I'm making assumptions. What is your take? Like, this room here feels a certain way about the way things are going. I know there's a big wide room out there that sees it completely differently. Fair?
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about looking at the globe all day today, and thank you, watching for the news, but what distresses me more than anything is sort of what underlies the lack of trust, which is, I think we've gotten to a point where we don't share a belief in a certain reality or a certain truth. You know, there are people that I could explain how my job works to them on both a macro and a micro level, and they still would kind of just go, yeah, but like, come on, like you're having one over on me. And I notice it even, and my whole job is sort of sifting the wheat from the chaff and trying to make sense of things and figure out what is fair and what is, you know, bamboozlement. And when I do a TV panel that we're going to talk about an issue I don't know about, I'll go and read up on it. And even I mean, I have my trusted sources, you know, there's my litmus test of, I know these are reliable professional journalists, I'm gonna get a fair deal here. And even I sometimes can't sift out the shades of gray, the nuance, the way things have been torqued. But that's on a very like, granular level. I mean, look at what the White House is doing with their press briefing room now, where that sounds like that's so inside baseball, but it matters, where they have folded in these people who are not journalists, they're partisan toadies, and they know how to sort of like the White House press room seems aware of sort of the conventions of what looks like what will make them look legitimate. And so they've cherry picked who asks the questions. So now within one room in a very powerful context that we're all used to seeing, we all know what that briefing room looks like, you have sort of alternate realities dueling in real time. And then you have people bringing their confirmation bias to it and deciding which version of it they buy.
Yeah.
I find that sort of existentially terrifying.
I feel like we're not persuading anymore.
No.
I feel like it's dead. I feel like we're in our camps. And anybody can jump in here that Shannon, your point, like facts are now in camps
Up for
and
grabs.
debatable or up for grabs. And how, I would say in the last 5 years, it's accelerated. Maybe even the last 3 years.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, data has exploded, right? And so, like anything else, we're humans. We find a way to get an edge. So data are being weaponized. And so it's no longer about necessarily what's the fact, but it's this sense of belonging. I mean, have a look. I mean, the biggest proportion of the household size today is singles, right? So there's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of isolation. So we're becoming isolated economically. We're becoming isolated, socially. We're also becoming isolated when it comes to what it is that we're consuming. And so the facts matter now less than this notion of belonging. And the media and the social media tend to kind of, portray things like you said, your algorithm determines. And so so the techniques to be able to counter this misinformation, isn't more information. It's about how do you go to the influencers? Who do you believe? Who do you trust? And so the counter to the lack of information isn't more information. And so we have to figure out, how does this work? Like 2/3 of people who are under the age of 35 now get the majority of their information on social media. It's the other way around for seniors. 2/3 of them get it through the traditional way.
Right.
So it's not going away. I mean, we're just, that ecosystem is getting more complicated. Data are weaponized. And so the answer isn't to put out things that are nuanced as if they're black and white and true. I think we have to engage people, and we have to engage the right people, and we have to make sure that the context is available to them.
And Katherine, how do you do that in that environment when you're trying to turn around a reputation and an institution that people care deeply about? That you're faced with that kind of environment to try to win back trust.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's sort of a difference between talking about hockey in Canada and Hockey Canada, the institution. So, make sure that I'm kind of separating those things there. I do want to respond, I will respond to that question, but I do want to respond to one of the reasons that I felt like over the last few weeks, people have been rabidly following Team Canada. It's not just, I think, sort of a patriotic, you're wearing the maple leaf, but I really do think sport is one of those few ways where there's a couple things in there, is despite any political beliefs, any kind of political leanings, I mean, there's one thing that we can all talk about, on a Zoom call or around the water cooler or, standing on a bus. Did you see the game last night? Did you see that goal? What did you think about something? There's a language that brings us together, and particularly when it's Team Canada, it really brings Canadians together. The other thing I think that I've really been noticing about, we chatted a little bit about this last night when we were talking, is that in sport, the rules are really clear. You step out in the field of play, doesn't matter if you're playing the Russians, the US, the Swedes, the Finns, you know exactly the size of the field of play, you know where the lines are, you know what the calls are, you know what the referees are going to call and what they're not going to call, and everybody knows, you know, how long the game's going to take. All of those things start to matter because it's a place where we can talk about and we all know what the rules are. So there, you know, you can argue about, you know, who you think has better skill, or you know, whether the line that was being played you know, well or not. But at the end of the day, you know what the rules of the game are.
Everything else feels the opposite of that.
Exactly.
I can't get my hands around anything anymore. It feels like, you know, 30 years on the air, covering politics explain what's going on in the White House. Yeah. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think
people who don't do it for a living.
Well, you know, and like you, I mean, I actually still have, you know, my front porch is covered in papers when I come home because my kids always forget to bring them in when I've been traveling. But, you know, to talk about Hockey Canada, though, I think, you know, there's a couple things. One is hockey, because of what I just talked about, hockey is something that, you know, Canadians, we were kind of the public trust for hockey, I would say, and sort of represented a lot of what that is. And when Canadians feel let down, they feel unbelievably let down by the institution. So, you know, a lot of the work that we have to do really it's the basics of trust. It's being extremely transparent about what we're doing. It's about making decisions based on agreed to values. It's about constantly checking in with your public and with your members and with your key stakeholders, and making sure that they not only understand that what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how well we're doing it, or not doing it, and being open and honest about all those things. And, you know, I think it was Matt that talked about even like your personal relationships. You know, that's what you have to do in order to maintain a relationship. You have to be transparent and open and converse and check in and do all of those things. So
and
that's
that
very
applies
much
to everybody's organization here, not
Yeah.
just hockey.
Yeah.
And because you were at a low point and you're building back up and doing quite well, I think it's fair to say. That's some great advice. Shannon, you touched on it a bit, talking about panel discussion and everything. There are people, as you know, who just don't believe. They think you're like social media, like you just put anything out there.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself explaining to people in your social circles how hard it is to get something into the Globe and Mail and the standards that you uphold, or do you bother anymore? Because I'm exhausted. I just don't. And I should, but I don't, because it's just I feel like I can't win people over.
To be honest, most of the time I fall into that camp. I'd love to give you the more sort of activist, optimistic answer. But that's what I mean about I feel like people are bringing their priors to this. And whatever they already believe, because to your point, truth is tribal now, and it is about belonging. And it is, I mean, in a very mechanical way in Canada now, especially if you're a particular demographic, if your worldview is formed by what you see in your Facebook feed, which again, it is very demographically dependent, or your TikTok feed or whatever, you're not getting what I would term legitimate news there because they've turned it off because of a dispute with the government over payment. So there's no ballast there to balance out whatever you're getting from whatever other groups you follow or are fired into your face. And I think a key part of this too is that there's a marketplace of distrust now. I mean, there's more innocuous versions of it, maybe with influencers and things like that, but the idea is that there is no like capital T truth or capital R reality anymore. You know, like in a very crass way, like during the pandemic, you know, you would have people saying, don't get vaccinated, use this like essential oil. And you saw this kind of weird, like flat circle where you had like the granola moms overlapping with like the convoy people. And so it shows you how strange these kind of tribal notions of truth get. But my point is, I don't think truth or professional information processors or whatever the other, like my camp is, it's not a neutral battle. There is another side that is actively trying to put out, like that idea, you know, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. We are well past that. And people think that the idea that there are facts, that in itself might be a trick or a power move.
That something's being put over on them that they're not sure about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there is some of that, a lot of that is a product of social media and sort of the disaggregation. Like pendulums, they always swing and they always swing too far back, right? We all know there were a lot of corrosive societal effects out of an overly sort of authoritative and authoritarian kind of information network, like when you had the guy who delivered the 6 o'clock news and everyone listened and there was only one version of truth, that got us a lot of bad stuff as a society too. But now we've gone to, it's whatever is in your pocket, on your phone, whatever you heard from your neighbor. I mean, the idea of trust being local makes perfect sense until what you're getting from your neighbor is just whatever they heard or saw, and that carries as much weight as something you might hear from your doctor or whoever. Like, it's just an absolute disaggregation of authority and reality.
Couple of things, Anil. Speaking to Shannon's point, in the pandemic, our phone at CTV Ottawa was ringing off the hook because people were scared and they wanted to know what to do. We barely got on the air. It was like old school because the pandemic was so local, right? Like it was different in Kitchener than it was in Ottawa, than it was in Toronto, than it was in New York. And so people couldn't get good information on the internet about what to do around the corner, right? And so that to me was a moment where I'm like, okay, there's some hope here. But then, of course, it morphed. It morphed into, do you agree with Shannon that we're at this point now where facts are not the same for persuasion is dead, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're all experiencing reality differently, right? There is no average kind of thing. And so, if you're in the top 20th kind of, percentile of the most wealthy in Canada, you own 64% of the wealth. If you're in the bottom 40, not 20, 40, you are now owning 3.3% of the wealth. Your average is $83,000. If you're in the top 20%, your worth is $3.3 million. And many of them feel that their lot in life is not good, that they should be earning more. And so everybody's in this kind of, and when you look at satisfaction and trust, there's a real correlation between that. But they also feel that they've been left behind because, the person that they know, owns 4 condos instead of them only owning 2. So satisfaction and wealth, and so that whole notion of how you're experiencing things. So do you believe, so if you look at the Midwest in the United States, after all the manufacturing jobs went away, well, that whole generation and the next generation after that has not seen a positive. In Canada as well, we've got similar kinds of statistics that you got one generation and the next generation isn't any better off. So to tell them that things are good and that they're getting better, they're not experiencing it in that same way. And so the distrust of, whether I'm going to lose my job or even keep my job or get a job, or whether I'm going to be able to buy a house or have kids or whatever, and will my kids be able to do that? That is very real. And that's what they think about day in and day out. Are they going to build it? Are they going to trust the system? Probably not.
Yeah. Our perception is that the Americans are further apart in income disparity. I think the numbers bear that out.
Yeah.
But it's also, that's easy to dismiss what you've just described in Canada. And we do that at our peril. Does any of that surprise you, Katherine, in terms of where people are and how it fits into a distrust paradigm, I guess?
No, I mean, I'm dealing with an amateur sport organization, as well. I think it's actually it's a place where communities come together. Like they find commonalities, and I've experienced hockey, at the very highest levels and being able to hand out medals and trophies and things like that. But I've also experienced it sitting on a bench at the Don Montgomery Arena at Eglinton and Midland with my son, when he was, for the 10 or 15 years that he played. And so, I think when you're in community and you've got these things that kind of pull you together, that's actually where I see the seeds of optimism and hope and community and trust. You get these little bubbles of it where it happens. I think sport can be a really important part of building back that sort of confidence and hope and trust that Canadians can have. It's not the be-all and end-all. Hockey's not going to solve all of our global problems, but it is certainly a place where I think if it's done really well, and it's done with the right people with the right values, including my fellow Canadians and many of you in this room, I think we can really help in that area.
Live music, live sports,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Some of the few things
Yep.
that we collectively, and we could have a debate about that as well. We're going to get to questions in just a few moments. I do want to go down the line on this disturbing question that Matt highlighted on willingness to commit violence to achieve. I thought about in the recession way back in the 90s. I'm pretty older. I thought about a friend of mine who had no problem paying under the table, just didn't want to pay taxes, started paying cash, totally out of character, and he's just like, I can't move. The taxes are and the interest rate. I just can't move, so I'm just going to do it. And I'm looking at that stat. I'm reminded of that. Any sense, Shannon, you're seeing any sense of a turn away from societal norms that seems to suggest might be happening, especially for younger people?
Well, I think the scarcity, the inequality we're talking about, it makes perfect sense to me that feeds the grievance. That was one of the big findings here. I mean, of course, if you feel like you're not getting a fair share, you turn inward, you start to look out for number one. I mean, what's the difference between a thief and Robin Hood? It's that you've decided Robin Hood is on the side of goodness and light. And if you decide that's who you are, then whether you're paying under the table or taking advantage or whatever, all you're doing is evening out the scale. Like you're not a baddie right now, you're a goodie because the whole system is rigged against you. And I think that is a huge thing that's happening right now. I mean, we saw last year, I think they were calling like the year of elections. It just happened that like a third of the world population or something was having elections and booting out their incumbents en masse because of the pressure, like that constant turning vice of inflation and how that made people feel like every time you fill up your car, every time you buy groceries. You were talking about the hatred directed toward Galen Weston. He was the perfect avatar for that. It was like 2 minutes hate from 1984. Of course it was the dude in the sweater vest. Like, of course it was. Yeah. And so I just think when you get to scarcity, a feeling of I can't get ahead or my kids can't get ahead, I did find the generational contours of that really interesting, that younger people were more likely to be optimistic about getting ahead than their parents and grandparents were. Yeah. Super interesting. And then the demographic contours of it were flipped for the willingness to do like bad things to even the scales. It makes perfect sense to me in terms of human nature, that if you feel like the system's rigged against you, well, you better re-rig it to even things out a little bit.
Yeah. Anil?
Well, look, I think, think back to your schooling days or university days, right? Weren't those the days that you went out and kind of protested and said, we're going to carry this, or I have a cause, so some of that has always been there, okay? And so I think generally in that cohort, there's this kind of I can change the world, and so I need to, take ownership for this and so on. So I think that's happening. And then when you look at what, when this survey was taken, what was going on? You remember the Middle East crisis. You look at a lot of things, that the housing crisis. We had the immigration thing. So it went from, okay, this is even more pronounced, right? And now who do I blame for these things? Because my formula is not working for me. I'm going to have to take things into my own hands. And so you see all the, you see the crime, right? All the auto thefts are up. You see the hate crimes are up like 1,000%. And so you see a number of these kinds of things happening. So, when people get cornered and they don't see their efforts kind of, yielding the success when you play by the rules, then they go, well, you got to change the rules. Mm-hmm. Now, in some societies, they're saying, just like, it doesn't matter. I don't care what you replace it with. I just want this system burned. Like, it's done. It's not going to work for me or my kids. So they're expressing this fact of, we'll figure out what it is next, but this has to go.
Yeah. Before one more thing before we get to questions. Surprised at CEOs in Canada? Katherine? We're low. We're near the bottom of the world.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. First of all,
Yes.
one thing. I just want to say, I understand that hockey isn't available to everyone in Canada. I do think that there's a rift, and we've got to make sure that every kid that wants to play sport of choice can play sport. So yes. I'm very much behind that. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't being tone deaf on that.
$300 for a hockey stick.
Yeah.
It's a problem for sure.
It is definitely
You don't
a
have to
problem.
spend that much, but if your kid's in competitive hockey, everybody else has
Yeah.
one, and boy,
Yeah, no,
it's
your
hard.
your kid doesn't want a wooden hockey stick,
Yeah.
But to go back to the CEOs, no. I mean, people, they don't know who to grieve to. They don't know. There's got to be, you hear about people talking about the man, I work for the man, or the man's done this, the man's done that. And I think if your grocery bills are too high, or hockey's too expensive, or, if filling up the gas, or you come fifth at World Juniors, that there is a great deal of vitriol out there to say, look, I just need a name and a face. I want someone to blame. I'm overwhelmed, and I need someone to blame right now. So I am not surprised in an environment where Canadians are feeling very, put upon and distrustful, that they are looking for places to kind of focus those grievances. So I'm not surprised.
I guess the ultimate haves, Shannon, they take the place of the ultimate haves, obviously, a CEO.
Yeah, like I said, the word avatar comes to mind, or mascot. It's like it's a punching bag. But I also do think, I don't want to suggest that there is nothing to that sentiment. I think there's a lot of evidence that bigger systems are rigged against ordinary people, and that mobility is down and inequality is up. And so that suggests that this is not all in people's heads. Like there are things working against them, and they're having the temerity to notice it and get mad about it. So I would never, I think there's a point at which that becomes really corrosive and socially destructive, but I don't think people are wrong about the general thing they're seeing. I'd be curious to see what the results are when inflation lightens up and there's not that daily pressure. Like, just everything feels very fraught, very turned up right now. But I don't know, like the same way grocery prices are never gonna go back down, they might just flatline. I don't know if that temperature is ever gonna get turned back down. Maybe the best we can hope for is some sort of stasis. Doesn't look likely given the way things are going today, but you never know.
And I mean, one metric alone, Neil, like you talked about the housing price, right? Like grocery price is fair, but I mean, look at the cost of rent, look at the,
I always say inflation, like CPI, right? Just because it's at 1 point something, it doesn't mean that things got cheaper. That's deflation. We're still at inflation. So the level is where it is. It's just that the rate of change is kind of gone down. So you're absolutely right. We're not going backwards to affordability. We're just kind of, making unaffordability just go at a slightly different pace. So that experience is absolutely real.
Enjoyed this conversation. This is great. We're going to stay here with our mics on. Bianca has a mic on, Matt has a mic on, and we've been talking a lot. Anybody have any questions or anything you want to add to this? You see one in the back there.
Our young people 18 to 35 are looking at social as their main source of information. I'm confused. How are they getting that information? And secondly, if they are the most optimistic, and you connect those dots, are they optimistic for the wrong reasons?
The last part is like existential. I mean, I think it's a massive problem, as I said, that the corrective of professional news is not available to like stanch the flow of garbage and counterbalance it. There's not even, but maybe in people's social feeds. I'm comfortably middle-aged, so I don't know what people younger are consuming. Like, I'm just waiting out TikTok. Not doing it. But it's an excellent question. Like, what are they consuming? What is making them feel optimistic? Maybe it's good that they feel optimistic, but is that based in reality? I don't know, but as I said, I get more depressed and more worried about like the level below that, which is the level at which plenty of people would roll their eyes at me and think it's somewhere, it's either elitist or delusional for me to think that it's important for people to have access to news sources like the Globe or the New York Times or whatever that I consider to be valid and fair and balanced. There are lots of people who would think I am the sucker, and they would authentically believe that. And that's where I think the problem actually lies. It's at that level, like that's what makes me feel real bleak.
Can I just make a quick point on optimism? So the youth or the younger cohort, they're not any more optimistic than some of us were when we were that age. So in fact, their level of optimism has actually come down It's just that, when you're in that stage of life, you got the whole life in front of you. I'd hope that they'd be more optimistic than somebody who's thinking, I only got a few more years left. So
That's optimistic.
This is just getting cheerier.
That's what I thought I'd inject some more. But
humor.
then, youth have always been in that stage of life more optimistic.
Good point.
In fact, they're less optimistic in a relative sense because of all the financial and other, and isolation and all those kinds of things. So I just want to add a little bit of that precision.
I think we had a question right here. Yep.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about housing as one of the examples, and I think it's illustrative of what I want to ask. One of the challenges that I've seen is even institutions aligning on what the facts are. Like, forget the misinformation and the weird TikTok guys. If we look at housing, for instance, for decades now, we've seen a difference between the StatsCan work and what Ontario projects as housing projections, and even differences between ministries at the provincial level on what housing need projections are going to look like, and then something wildly different in terms of what we've actually seen from populations growing. And this is, as something that's contributed to the housing crisis. But when we're in a position where our institutions even struggle to align on what is the reality of the very basic statistics that underlie what we need, and they can't do it, how do we forget about what people think? How do we solve that problem to start with?
Good question. That's good. Yeah, look, first of all, there's so many different ways to calculate something, right? I mean, if you just take the average price of all houses, you'll get a number, right? But if you were to say, okay, single houses as opposed to condos, as opposed to, well, you're going to get a very different kind of mix. And if you're building an index, you're going to get a very different. So I think, we all agree on what's happened and where we are. It's how do you calculate where we're going, right? So where's immigration? What is a family size going to look like? What is the rate at which these things are going to grow? What is going to be the price and the supply-demand differential? And that's when it gets really, really complicated. So it's the crystal ball that makes everybody a prophet or whatever it is, and then they kind of compete with their version of the truth. So we know in pretty good sense where we are and how we got to it, and we align ourselves. We can explain why there are some differences. It's the going forward. And that's really problematic when you grow at a rate that we haven't grown since the 1950s. I mean,
Yes.
that kind of growth rate now is incredible.
But if I can, I think that connects directly to the idea of trust, because that's when you get, say, news stories or public discourse that says, well, this party says, I don't mean political party, this entity says this is what's going on, this entity says this is what's going on. And that's when people get to, you know what, a pox on all their houses. They're all lying to me. So I think there's a direct connection there in that it feels like you can't sort through it and everyone's trying to spin for their own benefit, and people just they just kind of walk away.
And on that, you mentioned immigration and the growth. I was on the air when the numbers came out, and people will correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not remember a large debate at all about boosting our immigration levels to 1950s levels. Or to whatever it was. It was a massive increase, right? Massive. And I had to read it 4 times before I went on the air and said it, because I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the number. I think it was a StatsCan number that was coming out that day in the Daily about our immigration levels. And I'm like, and the way it connects is how do we measure things? And the other thing is, as Matt was saying, their choice was to not go out there. Whoever in government, whoever in the immigration department, was to not go out there and not discuss this because people would freak out. Well, what happened? They didn't say anything. And then everybody started to point at all of the problems, the emergency room, the housing crisis, my kid's school. It's all because you've boosted immigration. You didn't talk about it. And I know there's more to it. I'm oversimplifying, but it's one of those case studies where it's just like, wow, if it had gone a different way, could it have been better? I just and it unleashes so much, right? It unleashes so much that's so damaging. That's another thing that really concerns, I think, a lot of people. I'm sorry, I'm kind of at an angle here. Are there other questions that side of the room? Anybody else? We've got one back here. Sorry, the lights are on. Yep.
Here. Right here. Right.
It's over here? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we've got one over there, and there's one in the middle here. Is that right?
Hi there.
Oh.
Thanks for this panel. I'm curious. I think one of the things that we've seen kind of happen over the last, let's say, few months, there's this walking away from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I think in a lot of ways it's been part of some of the trust kind of deficit that's happening on the right. But then on the left, people are seeing corporations move away from DEI initiatives and wondering, did you ever actually mean it? Was it real? That kind of thing. And so I'm curious, like, it feels like there's this distrust on both sides, and how organizations should be approaching this kind of topic in terms of building trust, knowing that like what DE&I is meant to do is kind of uplift those voices, but it's been tribalized, I guess.
Very good question. You do, Matt, please. Thank you.
So it's a very timely question, and it's a complex one. And I'm going to provide remarks probably that are largely led from a U.S. context. I know it's a conversation that's happening in Canada as well. I think right now we're looking at only a couple of companies really taking a stand that's quite distinctive because they're doubling down in a very public way, and it's Apple and Costco. And I think their leadership have decided, they're very much focused on their customer base, and they've been very explicit about that. The companies with whom I've been speaking, and leadership teams that I've been speaking with, they are changing their altering language to be less of a lightning rod, because of really what the federal government has dictated through executive order. And those with federal contracts actually now have to make some distinctive changes, or they're outside the law and they run the risk of losing federal contracts, which is, cascade job loss, it's a whole impact. But even in those instances, they're not backing away from their long-term commitment to a diverse workforce, to creating a civil, inclusive work environment. But they are trying to navigate and walk the edge of a knife, which I think it's proving very complicated. And I think there are more challenges that lie ahead for all businesses. And this is particularly, again, as I say, in the US, because we know, I think this is a reality of the moment. And I think it is a moment that, because of the shock and awe that has occurred over the last 45 days or 6 weeks, trying to figure out where the level is, or where the agenda is going, is really complicated. And so for the moment, just trying to not get caught in harm's way, I think is driving a lot of CEO thinking. And so on the DEI front, I don't see people backing away. They are collapsing structure, but they're trying to infuse their companies differently and deploy talent differently. So it's a pendulum swing without question. But I'd say the majority. There are some that are taking advantage and backing out completely. But I'd say the majority recognize that diverse workforce that's reflective of society and of consumers is ultimately in everyone's best interest. They're just having to navigate that through a very difficult lens. A similar conversation is very much around ESG, where those letters have become toxic in the US. And yet, I've talked to clients, they who have the long view recognize the energy transition is not an optional sport, but they're just having to think about how they go about it differently. And it's not a place I find most business leaders like to be in on either topics at the moment, but they're trying to navigate a very changed world very rapidly. And I think for the most part, the pendulum feels like it's swung full back. I think it will land long-term in the middle, particularly on the diversity piece of it.
Excellent question. First of all, 100% of our labor market growth now is through immigration. And as you know, most of our immigration is from countries that are non-white and people that look like me, okay? And when you look at the labor market and you look at, when you control for experience, language, all those kinds of things, there's still a huge component which is unexplained. Like, why is it that, people who are racialized, people who are indigenous, people who have disabilities, et cetera, why are they staying at those levels much longer? Why aren't they, getting the kind of promotions and so on? I mean, it's like and it's by no means is the battle won, but women were not seen in executive positions for a very long time until there were measures taken to kind of right-size some of that inequity that was there. So I think the business case for DEI is still very real, and it's going to be problematic if Canada doesn't, deal with some of these things.
Yep.
However, I think, coming back to the kind of the how come the rules, are not working for me, is that there's a whole, white men for the most part said, like, what the heck? What is this? Like, I played by the rules. I worked really hard. It's my time. What do you mean? Now you're going to bring in something else. So I think, we worked really hard on the equity side. We did not work hard on the inclusion side. Like, we did not engage and we did not figure out that. And so now I think you're seeing this kind of, pendulum shift, a little more, as Matt said, in some areas and a little bit more nuance. I'm not sure it's dead, but I don't think in its current form it will move forward. So we're going to have to figure that out. What does this look like? Because it was never meant to be exclusionary, right? Inclusion means everybody. So we still have to kind of debate this, engage, and still work on the case.
Over here. You could shout it. I think we can hear you. Oh, here's another mic.
Okay, great. So I'm just actually curious. I know we speak a lot about business and the context with that. All of this kind of got me thinking about your thoughts on the next generation of leadership and younger leaders, and what does that, how does this all kind of play into it? Because eventually there's going to be a new crop of leaders, and what is that looking like? What is that shaping out to be? It seems like a lot of this distrust is coming a lot from, again, younger folks who are not too happy about it. So, yeah, just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Personally, I'm kind of I'm in awe of the young folks, generally speaking, like the way they adapt, the way what's at their fingertips now. When I was in my 20s, compared to what they have now, like their comfort with all forms of video and all forms of communication is mind-blowing for me at 54 years old. That's my view of it. Like I just think that they're in the chaos that is our consumption of information. I think they are in a very strong position, even though the ground feels like it's shifting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Katherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we're talking about, sort of tips for leadership for young people as they're moving forward, I mean, kind of you got to take this kind of information and read them and weep a little bit, but then you have to move forward, right? And I think Canadians in these surveys are telling us what they want from their leaders. They want leaders they can trust, who tell them the truth, who explain their answers, who are accountable, who do what they say they're going to do and how they're going to do it. There's some really good information that's provided in areas like this Trust Barometer, for example. And I promise you, I don't work for Edelman, I think it's really obvious, based on what people are upset about, is the way you need to be going into the future. And for young leaders, I would absolutely, read the tea leaves and say, this is the type of leader I need to be.
Bianca?
Is my mic on?
Yeah.
There we go. Ooh. At Edelman, we do have a really young workforce, so I just feel like I can comment on this. Our young workforce is so incredibly collaborative, and they're so incredibly values-based. Like, it's in your DNA if you're in the room and you're a young Edelman employee. I can see it every day in how you move. This whole idea of inclusion and creating a culture of belonging, it's just who you are. It's how you grew up. And so, to me, my favorite moments are spent with young people, because I feel so optimistic about what our leadership will look like. The other piece is that we are not us, well, I think I am the youngest CEO, Matt can, at Edelman, but overall, younger folks coming up are better communicators. Like, they are so crisp because they cut through the BS that sometimes we like to package our stuff in. It's just so clear, and you see it because they've, you've grown up on TikTok, short form, and that really is a superpower in leadership roles because we can communicate with clearly and effectively. So I guess to answer your question, I just feel very optimistic about the future with young leaders rising up.
Look at that. We are wrapping things up on a positive note. Thanks so much, Bianca, and thanks to Matt, thanks to my panel. My first Trust Barometer, it's been a thrill to be back here, and what a beautiful space the Globe and Mail has built, and great to have all of you here. And you don't have to leave, we're going to have some socializing. But thanks so much, and please thank my panel for us, please. Thank you.